57 missions, and they told me that I could go home if I would agree not to try to get transferred when I was in the States. I said, we'll worry about that later. Just let me go home. So I went home on a 30-day leave, and I missed the invasion. I got home on June 5th, and my dad woke me up in the morning and on the 6th, and he told me, he said, look at this, he said, look at the headline. He said, the invasion's on. I said, good, and I turned over and went back to sleep. So it was a pretty good invasion for me. But I made up for it a little later. After my 30-day leave, I went back to Atlantic City. The Air Force had taken over a couple of hotels there, and our crew reassembled there. Our co-pilot didn't go back with us. When he was a cadet, he had an automobile accident, and the car turned over, and he got battery acid on his fingers. And it came and went with the irritation. But the flight surgeon says, no, he says, we're going to keep you home this time. So he didn't go back with us. We picked up another co-pilot after we got over there. I flew 9 more missions. One was, I recall, was to Metz. They wanted us to hit the old fortifications there. And I was flying with another crew. I flew with 4 or 5 different crews then because they were all mixed up, people on leave and things like that. And my pilot was off somewhere else, and so I started flying with a number of people. And this particular day, I was up there in my favorite spot in the turret, and we were just got the bombs away, and we're turning off the target off of Metz, and there was a tremendous sound under us, a big whoosh noise, and you won't forget it once you hear it. I mean, 2 or 3 in a row. And that airplane went up in the air, and I felt like my stomach was suspended in the air. And right at the top of this, it's sort of like you were balancing on a fountain of water, and then somebody shut the water off. We dropped, and the wing dropped about maybe a 45-degree angle, and we slid off to the side, and I heard the co-pilot holler, they got us, bail out, bail out. So I start scrambling out of that turret, and my, unknown to me, my elbow hit that microphone cord, or the headset cord, and disconnected it. And I pulled on this cable that was underneath the seat, on the front edge of the seat, and it wouldn't release. Evidently, when all this was going around and me bouncing up and down in that turret seat, the little metal hooks on either side got bent somehow, and they wouldn't pull out. So here we are, still at an odd angle, losing altitude at a pretty good clip. And I'm calling like mad on the intercom, I'm still with you, I'm still with you, I'm in the turret. So I didn't hear anything. So then I noticed a little shiny thing off to my left there, and there, sure as hell, there was that brass fitting on that headset and the microphone. I disconnected both of them. So I plugged those in real quick, and I says, I'm back here. I said, I'm still with you. And the co-pilot comes in. He said, we're going to be okay. He said, everybody just hang on, we're all right. So that was a pretty nervous time there. And then the last mission I flew, my 66th mission, was, they told us they wanted us to relieve the troops up in Arnhem, Holland. They had 2 Panzer divisions on one side of the bridge, and the British were on the other side, and they wanted us to go in there and stir up the dust around those tanks. So that was pretty good cloud cover, and they decided not to drop. The flak was good also. I heard it several bursts go that day. And we didn't drop because Bombardier said later that the clouds are too patchy, and it was too much of a risk if they missed that narrow span. They could just as well trail them over to where the good guys were. So we came on back and didn't do much of a service for them. I guess maybe the Germans ran off a bit and hid while we were overhead. At least that gave them some relief, but that's about all. And then October 2nd, the group moved from Great Dunmow, England, over to France, to Beaumont-sur-Oise, which is a former target of ours. And I didn't fly over there on combat missions, but I did a lot of the courier work. We went over to a French base there and picked up a bunch of cases of carburetors, on one thing I remember. And one of the fields we landed at was a wrecked Focke-Wulf 190 on the field. I told my pilot, it was just he and I flying. And we just landed. I said, wait a minute, let me out of this thing. He said, what are you going to do? I said, I want to go over by that Focke-Wulf. I want to get that swatch there. He says, you're crazy. How are you going to get that off? And I took the escape hatchet off there by the flight deck, and I went over there and started chopping on that thing. He's sitting with the engines idling. He says, come on, get back in here. He says, I'll bring you back. I says, no, you won't. He says, yeah, I will. He says, I'll bring you back. I says, okay. So I got back in the airplane, and we went and got those parts and took off, flew them over the field, and dropped them off at the maintenance shack. He says, well, come on, let's go. So we got back in the airplane, and he took me back over there. And I spent an hour hacking on that fin, and finally I got that thing off of there. It had a double thickness of aluminum, and there were 3 or 4 channels riveted to the back of that. And so I finally got my swastika, and I got back in our airplane, and we flew back to base. And the squadron commander was, at that time, was George Howard. He was the pilot I flew my first mission with. And he said to me, he says, Klier, he says, you've been around here a long time. He says, I'd like to see you go home while you're still in one piece. And he says, I'm not telling you you can't fly, but he says, if you want to go home, he says, I'll cut your orders. And I says, well, I'll tell you, Major. I says, I never was one to push fate. I says, you say it's all right. I says, I'd be willing to leave this place. He says, I'll tell you what. He says, you go to the orderly room, tell me you want a 3-day pass. He says, I'll sign it. He says, by the time you get back, your orders will be here. So I went off to Paris and saw the sights and one thing and another. And came back to base, and a few days later, I got on a C-47 at Le Bourget Field on the northeastern corner of Paris and flew over to London. And that was really the last flight ever made in a U.S. Air Force airplane. Came back on a ship and went back to Boston and then on back to Minnesota, and then I was on leave then, and I went down to near Kelly Field in Texas. I was down there at Normoyle, and they had they said I had to attend an a meeting about overseas attitudes and what to expect and all this and that. So this captain was going on up there about all the things you will and will not do when you're overseas. And there must have been 200 or 300 guys in this. It was a post theater is what it was. He was up on the stage. And he says, are there any questions? And I got up and I says, Captain, did I understand you to say that this is an orientation for going overseas? And he says, yes, it is. I says, I think I've been railroaded. I says, I've already been overseas twice. He says, he laughed. He says, well, I guess you have. He says, but you take that up with your CO here. He says, I really don't know why you're in here. So I went back, and somebody in the audience there was a post reporter, and he came over and he wanted my story. So they printed up a full-page story that came out the following Friday on the base newspaper. And then from there, I went over to Atlanta, Georgia. There was an Army-Navy joint effort there where there was a kind of an itinerant pilot's place. They fly on cross country. Some would stay overnight, some would just refuel. And I was parking airplanes there for about a month or so. The pilots would get out, and we'd get in and taxi them down the line and park them in certain places where we wanted to. And then they called me in the orderly room one day and says, you're a high point man on the field, and you and Keltner, you both have 135 points. You can get out if you want to, and at that time, 85 points was required. I says, I'm ready, and he says, so am I. So they said, okay, we'll cut your orders, a couple days or so. So they called us in then and says, your orders are here. And we had a great big brown envelope. Each one has had all our service records were in this envelope. And Klier was on one and Keltner on the other. And we parted company and shook hands. He was going down to Fort Sam Houston, and I was going to Fort Snelling, Minnesota. And I said, let's not get these packages mixed up. He says, I got mine. I said, okay, my name's on this one, and away we went. I got back up to Fort Snelling, and I walked in there and threw the thing down on the reception desk, and I said, he says, getting out, huh? I said, yep. He ripped open that brown envelope and took out the records. He says, are you Staff Sergeant Keltner? I says, oh my God. What somebody down there at the base had done, they put his records in my envelope and vice versa. So I says, well, I know where they are. He says, where? I says, they're down